Today in class, we began thinking about the way in which religion, Judaism, affects daily life by looking at Jewish traditions. We want to keep in mind that the Ten Commandments provide a very important foundation for the behavior of all Jews. However, the traditions are going to become ways in which we can see the thinking, the beliefs about the religion affecting daily life through some key holidays. Unlike Hinduism and Buddhism, Judaism has some significant holidays that we're going to want to take a look at. But first, let's turn to thinking about what these traditions might mean in the context of Jewish history. So we started class with the definition of what is history, what is memory. On a piece of paper, students first defined what they believed was their definition of history. Many students wrote, history is the study of events in the past, or history is a set of recorded events. Beneath that definition, students wrote their definition of memory. Memory, for many students, was defined as what a person remembers about the past. A memory is a personal experience, one that may or may not be passed down throughout generations. This was the first thing we did in class today. I then prompted students to think about this scenario, a lunchroom fight. I wanted students to imagine that they were principal of a school and you just found out there was a fight in the lunchroom during lunch. You've asked many students and teachers who witnessed the fight to write down what they saw and who they think started the fight. Unfortunately, you have received many conflicting accounts that disagree about important details of the fight, like who started it, when it started, and who was involved. It's important to remember that no one is lying. So I presented this scenario. We talked about what was going on here a little bit, and then I tasked students to think about these questions. Who are the people who might have seen the fight? How could it be that some stories are different, even though no one is lying? And what might make one person's story more believable than another? So we went through and we began to debrief answers to these questions after students talked about it. Some obvious answers for who might have seen the fight might be teachers, might be students, might be friends of the people who were in the fight, lunch workers, security guards, deans, etc. How could it be that different stories of the event? How could there be different stories of the event if no one is lying? We arrived at the conclusion that everybody's perspective is a little bit different. Therefore, every story that we hear is going to be a little bit different, even though no one is technically lying. Someone may have arrived at the fight later. Someone may have shown up, but someone might have been blocking their vision. Finally, what makes one person's story more believable than another's? We talked a lot about how... Do you need something? I'm taping, that's why. That's okay. Sorry for the interruption. What might make one person's story more believable than another's would be this idea that the person in the relationship to the perpetrators who are in the fight. So a friend of the person who started the fight might want to protect their friend, or their enemies might want to hurt the person who started the fight. Ultimately, what we arrived at is that we have to hear the same story more than once. In other words, we have to corroborate, compare and contrast stories to figure out whose story might be more believable than another's. Once we established this, we returned back to this thinking about history and memory. And we thought, okay, after this scenario, what words or thoughts might need to be added to our definition to make it more complete? What we started thinking about was the fact that history is an argument without end. History includes evidence. So I go to primary sources, to artifacts, to construct my argument about what I think really happened. The argument can change in light of new evidence. So some documents, a primary source, an artifact might surface long after the event took place, which might change the way in which I view what really happened. Ultimately, history is written down, represented in books or in journal articles. The memory, on the other hand, is oftentimes an oral tradition passed down from generation to generation. It's far more personal, far more sacred than history because it is an individual's own recollection of what really happened. Oftentimes, we see this representation in memorials and in monuments, what the people of a particular time are choosing to remember. Also, it might be very personal. What some people choose to keep as a part of their memorial is going to be very different than what we see represented in text. From these definitions, then, I asked students to consider what is the relationship between history and memory. So if we move from left to right, we go from very secular events, the terrorist attacks of 9/11, the election of Obama in 2008, to more religious events like Siddhartha's Enlightenment or the crucifixion of Jesus. No matter what historical event, because all four of these are historical events, we have recorded evidence of all of these things happening. What, though, is the relationship between history and memory? And ultimately what we arrived at, of course, is that the memory of these events is going to be very personal. And it's going to be more personal depending on if you experienced it or not. Obviously, many people experienced more recent events like the 9/11 attacks or the election of Obama and may have a little bit more emotion than those events that are in the past, far away in the past. We also talked about the fact that history oftentimes is the representation of a memory of the collective, of the group, whereas memories are far more individual. This connects to Judaism because what I would argue is that the history of the Jews becomes an important component of their religious traditions. The memory that Jews have about their history, meaning Abraham leaving the town of Ur, the exodus from Egypt, the time in Israel, the time when they were exiled, the time when they rebuilt the temple, all of those are historical events. The memory that Jews have about those events are oftentimes seen in the traditions that they practice. So we move to what are the ways in which religion can be preserved. And we talked about that religions can be preserved through books, monuments, and traditions. There are other ways, but we really settled on those three ways, books, monuments, and traditions, as a way to think about how the religion can be preserved over time. I then tasked students to think about and remember the historical events of Judaism. The fact that Abraham is going to leave the town of Ur. He's going to travel over to the promised land after many years. His grandson Jacob will lead people to Egypt because they're trying to escape famine. Time in Egypt will bring Jews to a moment of slavery. After years of slavery, Moses will be tasked with leading the people to freedom, and the exodus of Egypt brings Moses on a journey throughout the Sinai Peninsula in search for the promised land. It is there where he receives the Ten Commandments. Ultimately, the Hebrews end back in Jerusalem to rebuild their kingdom under Saul, David, and Solomon. There's a period of exile, conquering, back and forth throughout the Middle East. Ultimately, though, the Hebrews will settle until the Romans conquer in the early part of about 100 BCE. Thinking about that historical events, I then tasked students to research the key holidays of the Jewish faith. The four holidays that we're going to focus on are Hanukkah, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Passover. Ultimately, you should be able to provide a brief description, what is celebrated, when it is observed, and where it is celebrated. Basically, the what is the definition, where is the time of year, and where is the place. Moving along, I asked students to think about this organizer as a way to think about putting their research into one place. So on their note sheet of notes that they were taking in class today, they added this chart. We then talked about some sites, websites that might be more helpful. One of the websites that I think is really helpful in talking about or researching Jewish traditions is going to be the website of the BBC. To get here, you'll open a new tab. You will click in BBC Religions, and it'll take you to this site. Click on the site. Here is a religion page. Scroll down to Judaism, scroll down to holy days, and here you see all of the holy days listed. I think that this website provides a very succinct, a very focused definition, time of year, and where it is celebrated, the answers to our research. Once the chart is complete, students are asked to finish by debriefing, answering these 3 questions. Write 2 conclusions about Jewish traditions. Which tradition best reflects the history? Which holiday is most religious, most sacred? And that was class for today, Thursday, October 23rd. Thank you very much.